Hey guys, tonight we begin with the extraordinary culinary spectrum of medieval Ireland, a land where one man's dinner was boiled oats and the other's was roast swans stuffed with almond cream and social hierarchy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome everyone to the channel History AM. Let us get straight to the story. No more headlines needed. So you wake up in a damp one-room hut made of wattle and daub. The roof leaks when it rains, which is always, and the air smells faintly of livestock and despair. It is breakfast time, if you're lucky. If not, it is still breakfast time, just with a more existential twist. Your options: oats, sometimes barley, always boiled. Occasionally, if the gods are smiling and the cow did not die last winter, you might stir in a splash of milk or a pat of butter, but mostly it's gruel, a kind of edible beige paste with the consistency of baby food and the excitement of tax forms. This was the reality of the Irish breakfast for the vast majority of people for centuries. It was not a choice. It was a matter of survival. The very air you breathe is thick with the smell of damp earth and peat smoke from the central hearth. The fire, which never truly goes out, provides a weak warmth that barely fights the cold moisture seeping through the walls. You can feel the chill in your bones, a deep cold that porridge is supposed to fix. Your stomach growls a hollow sound in the small hut. This daily gruel was often called brothchán in Old Irish. It was the foundation of the entire day. Historians still debate the exact consistency and preparation. Some argue it was thick porridge eaten from a wooden bowl, while others suggest it was often a thinner gruel or pottage closer to a soup. The truth is likely that it was both, and it depended entirely on how much grain you had left in the sack. If the harvest was lean, the brothchán got thinner. Medieval Irish porridge was not served in cute ceramic bowls with berry garnishes. It came in wooden troughs shared communally, or in simple wooden methers, which were square communal drinking cups. This was efficient and also a great way to get extremely familiar with your cousin's dental hygiene or lack thereof. The communal pot itself was a permanent fixture. It was rarely washed out completely. Instead, new oats and water were added to the remnants of yesterday's meal. This created a perpetually simmering mix, a sort of sourdough starter for gruel. It probably had a deeply sour, tangy flavor that modern palates would find shocking. Imagine the sound of the wooden spoon scraping the bottom of the iron cauldron. A rough, rhythmic sound that was the heartbeat of the home. The rough texture of the wooden bowl against your lips is a daily reminder of your station. This was not fine dining. It was sustenance. Salt was added when available, which was about as often as sunlight. Salt was a luxury commodity often controlled by coastal monasteries or wealthy lords. For an inland farmer, salt was precious. Sugar had not arrived in Ireland yet, and honey was rare and usually reserved for people who owned things like land weapons or functioning shoes, so flavor-wise the goal was not painful. Sometimes for a bit of flavor, wild herbs might be tossed in. Dandelion leaf sorrel or wild garlic could cut the monotony of the oats. It was a small mercy. Now let us talk texture. This was not the creamy oatmeal of modern breakfast cafes. This was somewhere between mortar and medieval regret. If you dropped your bowl, it could crack the floor or bounce, depending on how long it had been sitting. The oats themselves were not the rolled oats we know today. They were coarse. The grain was prepared using a quernstone. This was a simple hand mill, two circular stones, one on top of the other. The women would spend hours every morning grinding the dried oats into a rough meal. The sound of the stones grinding, a gritty scraping noise, was the first sound of the morning. It was laborious work. Your arms would ache. Your back would be stiff, and all for the simple paste. The texture was gritty. It was full of hulls and bits of chaff. You would be chewing your breakfast as much as swallowing it, and yet people survived on it because they had to. Oats grew well in Ireland's damp climate, and they did not need fancy tools and could be stored without much fuss. This was avena sativa. The common oat, a hardy grain that thrived in the wet and windy Irish weather. Wheat was for the rich. It was for the Normans and the church lands. Oats were for the Irish. For peasants, porridge was the cornerstone of life. Literally, they probably used leftover porridge as building material. This might be a slight exaggeration, but not by much. Leftover gruel would set into a hard block. This solid mass called stirabout, or sometimes soundly named pob, could be sliced. It might be fried in a bit of fat for a later meal if you had any fat, or it could be carried into the field for a cold lunch. It was food insulation, a brick of calories. This odd detail is not just a joke. Thick porridge was genuinely used to patch up small holes in the wattle walls, a sort of edible spackle. Why waste anything? The nutritional value was actually impressive. Oats provided slow-release energy. They were packed with fiber and protein. This diet, though monotonous, was what fueled the building of ring forts, the clearing of forests, and the endless cattle raids. The historical event tied to this food is the very survival of the Gaelic way of life. It was a diet that allowed a population to endure. Interestingly, porridge was not just a food, it could be weaponized. A particularly bad batch might be hurled at invading Normans or used to plug gaps in a leaking roof. Versatility was key in the 9th century, but even porridge had a social ladder. While the peasant ate gruel with water and salt, a chieftain might have his brothchán made with fresh milk or cream. He would have a generous dollop of honey or bog butter melted on top. Bog butter, that strange Irish habit of burying butter in peat bogs for years, gave it a sharp, cheesy flavor, so even the breakfast bowl was a map of your social standing. A monk in a monastery would also eat porridge. His would be made with care, perhaps with milk from the monastery's own herd. He ate it in silence in a refectory contemplating sin. The peasant ate it in a smoky hut contemplating the rain. Same food, different worlds. It was the great equalizer and the great divider. It was the fuel of medieval Ireland, a simple boiled grain that held a complex civilization together. After a soul-crushing bowl of porridge, what is next on the menu? Bread, not the fluffy, crusty kind that comes in linen baskets at French cafes. No, we are talking flatbread. Earthy, dense, mildly chewy, and just rustic enough to remind you that civilization is optional. Irish flatbread was the people's carb. Made from whatever grain was on hand, oats, barley, sometimes wheat if you were posh, and usually baked over stone or griddle. It was stone age chic meets early medieval budget constraints. This was the Iran, the daily bread that filled the gaps, porridge left behind. The dough had 2 ingredients, flour and water. Optional luxury items included salt, butter, or a slight sense of optimism. You kneaded it by hand. Imagine the feeling of the coarse meal under your palms, a gritty friction that was part cooking, part exfoliation. You would feel the dough come together, stiff and unyielding, not soft and pillowy. It was a dough that fought back. You shaped it into rounds and slapped it onto a flagstone by the hearth, or onto a griddle pan called a losat, heated by a fire that, for legal reasons we will pretend, did not fill the house with smoke and ash. The smell was immediate, a toasting grain aroma mixed with the sharp tang of burning peat. You would crouch by the fire, the heat stinging your face and eyes. You would flip the bread with your bare hands, a quick, pained motion you learned to master. Your fingers would be calloused and tough from the heat. This was not baking, it was a close quarters negotiation with fire. And if you are wondering, did they have ovens? Technically, yes. Clay beehive ovens existed in some settlements. But for the average peasant, baking was more of a performance art involving hot rocks, turf fires, and the occasional accidental toe scorching, the lasset itself. A heavy flat disc of iron or stone was a prized possession. It was often set on a tripod over the embers, and a good lasset heated evenly. It was a piece of technology passed down from mother to daughter. Broken lasset was a domestic tragedy. Historians still debate the exact prevalence of different grains in these breads, while oats and barley were clearly the staples for the common people. The extent to which wheat or pleur was available to non-elites is a matter of ongoing discussion. Pollen records and archaeological digs at ring forts sometimes show wheat, but this was likely reserved for the wealthy or for special feast days. For most people, it was oat bread or barley bread, dense and hearty. Flatbread was versatile. You could eat it plain. You could tear it up and dunk it in broth. You could use it to scoop food, wrap cheese, or silence a complaining child. It was a plate, a utensil, and a mild choking hazard all in one. It was the edible trencherman before trenchers were cool. You would use a piece of this bread to scoop up your pottage. The bread would get soggy, soaked in the flavors of the stew. and that would be the best part of the meal. A warm, wet bite of grain and cabbage. But let's not romanticize it too much. These were not puffy naan or pita breads. These were survival slabs. Leftover bread was dried and rehydrated as needed or fed to pigs. Sometimes it was so hard you could sharpen it and use it as a tool. That is probably not historically accurate, but honestly, it feels spiritually true. The legitimate historical event here is the constant need to protect this grain. The Irish annals are filled with accounts of raids where the primary goal was not just stealing cattle, but burning an enemy's grain store. Destroying the grain meant destroying the flatbread. And destroying the flatbread meant starvation. That wooden trough of oats and the lasat by the fire were symbols of national security. The taste of this bread was strong, nutty from the oats, or earthy from the barley. It was always slightly smoky from the fire. You would feel the coarse texture on your tongue. It required serious chewing. This was not a food you ate mindlessly. It was a food that demanded your full attention just to get it down. Of course, in noble households, bread went up market. Wheat became more common, and sometimes they even sift the flour. A radical act of refinement. This sifted bread, called a ranfine or white bread, was lighter and softer. It was a status symbol. The ability to eat bread that was not gray and gritty showed you had made it. But even kings did not have sourdough starters bubbling on the window ledge. That trend would not arrive for several centuries, along with the collective panic over how to keep them alive. In the end, Irish flatbread was the edible equivalent of a dependable friend. Sturdy, honest, a little coarse, and always there when you needed it. Unless the cows had eaten the flour again. It was the other pillar of the diet, the solid to porridge's liquid, the thing that made a meal feel like a meal. If porridge was the foundation of the Irish medieval diet, dairy was the cement holding the entire operation together. White, fatty, slightly sour cement. Ireland, blessed with endless rain and lush grass, quickly figured out that if you feed all that to a cow, something magical happens. And the milk. And if you are really brave and let that milk sit around for a bit, you get an entire culinary genre. Butter, buttermilk, curds, cheese, and something worryingly referred to as sour milk, which in fairness is exactly what it sounds like. The cow was not just an animal, it was the entire medieval Irish economy on 4 legs. The epic tales of Ireland, like the Táin Bó Cúailnge, were literally about stealing a very impressive bull. Your status, your wealth, your ability to pay rent, and your diet all depended on how many cows you had. A man was measured by his herd. Let us begin with the star of the show, butter, or M. This was not just food, this was wealth. The good churn of golden butter was as much a currency as silver, and probably more delicious. Making it was hard, exhausting work. Women would spend hours churning, a rhythmic, thankless task. Imagine the sound, the steady slosh of the milk in the wooden churn. Your arms burn, your shoulders ache, you can feel the muscles in your back screaming. The air in the hut is cool and damp, but you are sweating. The smell of the churning milk is slightly sour, and you are just waiting for that magical moment when the sound changes. When the sloshing becomes a dull thud, that is when you know the butter has broken or come. You feel a wave of relief. You have just made gold. The butter was stored in wooden containers, and here's the odd part. It was often buried in bogs to preserve it. This is not folklore. This is bog butter. Archaeologists have found massive wooden kegs of it, some thousands of years old, still preserved in the peat. The bog's low temperature, low oxygen, and high acidity made it a perfect prehistoric refrigerator. Historians still debate whether this was purely for long-term storage to hide it from raiders, or if it was an intentional aging process, a way to develop a specific flavor. The result was not the sweet, creamy butter we know. After months or years in the peat, it became waxy and pungent with a sharp, cheesy flavor, a bit like a very strong aged Parmesan. Imagine digging up a keg of this. A treasure from the earth. The medieval Irish were so serious about dairy, they literally named their legal fines in terms of how much butter you owed someone. These were the Brean laws, a complex legal system that governed everything. Stole a sheep, 2 tubs of butter, insulted a chieftain, that will be 4 tubs, and a deeply sincere apology. Milk by itself, bane, was not just for drinking. It was often fermented into sour milk or whey because refrigeration was a fantasy, and raw milk turns into a biology experiment faster than you can say dysentery. Buttermilk or brothchán, the liquid left over from churning, was the real daily drink. It was tangy, sharp, and incredibly refreshing, a kind of medieval probiotic sports drink. Cheese or kies existed, but do not picture the artisan wheels from a modern deli. Picture a grayish, slightly squishy block, probably made by accident when someone forgot their curds or gruel on a shelf. It was simple pressed curd cheese, salty and sharp. You did not nibble it with crackers. You gnawed at it like it owed you rent. It was survival protein. Even cream or yuwaktar made an appearance, especially in noble homes. It could be poured over berries, dolloped onto bread, or hoarded jealously by monks who knew that nothing said piety like full-fat dairy indulgence. Dairy was available across the classes, though naturally wealth meant more cows, and more cows meant more dairy, so while peasants scraped bowls of buttermilk, nobles floated their bread and cream like they were bathing in culinary superiority. In medieval Ireland, you were not just what you ate, you were what you milked, water essential for life, and in medieval Ireland also essential for getting violently ill. Hence, the unofficial nationwide program of just not drinking it unless you were really desperate or possessed the constitution of a particularly reckless goat. The average peasant did not have access to what modern people call safe drinking water. Their local stream doubled as a drinking source, a laundry spot, and occasionally a livestock toilet. The only thing it did not do was apologize. You might kneel by the riverbank. The water looks clear, but it carries the faint smell of mud and the pasture upstream. You dip your wooden cup in, and the water's icy cold, but as you drink, you taste a metallic tang from the peat and a silty, earthy finish. You try very hard not to think about what your neighbor's cow was doing in this exact spot an hour ago, and while boiling could kill pathogens, firewood was not free, and effort was a limited resource. After a full day of grinding oats or cutting turf, the last thing you wanted to do was start a secondary fire just to purify water that would still taste like mud. So most people skip the purification step and move straight to anything else. Enter milk, buttermilk, whey, and the all-time favorite ale. Yes, even children drank it. No, not because they had terrible parents, but because slightly fermented grain juice was safer than trusting the puddle near your pigsty. This ale or quorm was not the kind of drink that turns you into an amateur bard after 2 pints. It was weak low in alcohol and drunk by the bucket. It was liquid bread without the bread part. It was often called small beer. This was the standard, daily hydration. Historians still debate just how universally water was avoided. While some argue that everyone drank ale all the time, idea is an exaggeration. Most agree that water from unknown or downstream sources was a known risk, and that weak fermented drinks were the preferred and safer option for daily calorie intake and hydration. Peasants brewed it in small batches with barley water and sheer necessity. The process was simple. Grain was malted or allowed to sprout, then dried. This unlocked the sugars. It was then boiled and left to ferment naturally with wild yeast. The resulting brew was cloudy, thin, and probably tasted a bit sour, like yeasty bread water. It was not crisp. It was not refreshing in the modern sense. But it was hydrating. It had calories, and the fermentation process killed most of the dangerous bacteria that the local stream was cultivating. You would drink it from a wooden cup, lukewarm, and the slightly sour bready taste was just the flavor of survival. The women of the household were usually responsible for brewing. It was a domestic chore as important as baking or mending. Nobles had it brewed in vast quantities with added herbs or honey if they felt fancy or just bored. Their ale would be stronger, cleaner, and served with more ceremony, but the principle was the same. Whey or fwydl, the sour byproduct of cheese, was also popular, a kind of proto-energy drink minus the branding and FDA approval. It was cloudy, acidic, and perfect for staying hydrated while contemplating the futility of medieval life. Imagine drinking this. It is a pale, almost greenish liquid. It smells sharp, like a carton of milk that has been planning revenge. When you drink it, the taste is intensely acidic, a tang that makes your cheeks pucker, but it is also cooling and clean, cutting through the fat of a meal. Even mead made appearances, honey wine for the upper classes, because nothing says, I am better than you, like sipping your hydration from a goblet while the peasants drink tangy cheese water out of a gourd. To be clear, people did drink water, just carefully from running springs, preferably up mountain from the nearest cow, and only if no one saw you doing it. Lest they assume you had given up on life entirely, and so what started as a survival strategy became a cultural habit. Do not drink the water ever, an idea so strong it would echo into modern tourist advice for centuries to come. In medieval Ireland, hydration was an art, one that required ingenuity, fermentation, and the constant avoidance of dysentery. In medieval Ireland, meat was not something you just ate. It was something you waited for, like spring or justice, or your neighbor to finally admit that their goat was eating your cabbages. And when it came to protein, pork was king. Cows were too valuable for their milk and status. Remember, that was your bank account. Chickens were inconsistent. Fish were seasonal and came with church-mandated guilt. But the pig, yes, the humble oinking lard bank on legs, pigs were the medieval equivalent of a fridge that refilled itself. You could feed them leftovers, acorns, turnip peels, and questionable moral decisions. They would eat it all and turn it into delicious future bacon, a single pig or muck. It was a family's most important investment right after the cow. It wandered freely, foraging in the woodlands or around the edge of the settlement, getting fat on the generosity of nature and your discarded vegetable peels. But here is the catch. You did not just slaughter a pig casually. You waited and waited until winter. This was a major historical event for the household. Known as the Mart, or the winter slaughter, usually around Martinmas in November. The timing was crucial. The weather was finally cold enough to slow down spoilage, giving you a fighting chance to preserve the meat. Imagine the feeling on that day. The air is sharp and icy. Your breath plumes in front of you. The pig, which you have fed all year, is suddenly quiet. The whole family tenses. This is it, the most important culinary day of the year. There is no joy in the act, just a cold, grim necessity. The sound of it is quick, a sharp squeal that cuts through the morning frost, and then silence, a silence that means work and survival, because once that pig was down, it was go time. Meat had to be preserved fast, salted, smoked, dried, and prayed over. There were no freezers, no vacuum-sealed containers, and no margin for error. And that pig had to feed a household for weeks or months. If rationed correctly and you did not have too many freeloading cousins, the men would do the heavy butchering, but the women would take over for the preservation. You would have your hands plunged into the carcass. The blood warm at first, then rapidly cooling to an icy slime, the metallic smell of it. Sharp and clean, would fill your nose. You would work quickly. Your fingers numb from the cold air, your knife slipping on the firm flesh. The lucky bits, bellyham jowls, were smoked or salted. Salting was the most common method. You would need a massive amount of salt, a precious commodity. You would feel the coarse crystals, rough as sand, biting into the skin of your hands as you rubbed the salt deep into every surface of the meat. Your hands would be raw, chapped, and stinging, but you could not stop. Every inch had to be covered. The meat was then packed into wooden barrels in a thick bed of salt, creating its own brine. This salt pork would be the hard, chewy, but life-saving protein that got you through the lean months of Lent. Historians still debate the specific balance between salting and smoking in the average household. Smoking in the chimney-less huts was difficult to control, but hanging flitches of bacon in the rafters was common. Where the peat smoke, remember that ever-present smoke, would slowly cure the meat, giving it that distinctive dark and pungent flavor. The unlucky bits, feet, ears, kidneys, snout, were boiled or shoved into blood puddings and sausages, lovingly known as everything but the squeal. This is the odd detail. Waste was not a concept. The blood was carefully collected, mixed with oats or barley, and herbs like wild garlic, then stuffed into the intestines. You would eat this drishing or black pudding, fresh, fried in a little fat. It was a feast. The taste was rich, irony, and deeply savory, with a soft oatmeal texture that melted in your mouth. Bacon fat was saved for cooking, oiling pans, waterproofing boots, and occasionally styling your hair if you were very brave and very single. Now, noble households had more consistent meat access. They had forests for wild game, servants to pluck poultry, and entire smokehouses filled with salted pork slabs. Meanwhile, peasants stared at the pig all summer like it was a living ham, waiting for the day they could transform it from pet to pantry. It is worth noting that livestock theft was a serious crime in medieval Ireland. Steal a pig, and you were not just committing a crime. You were stealing months of planned protein, future stews, and entire winter meal schedules. That is basically medieval terrorism. In short, when the pig finally died, it was a culinary festival, a logistical operation, and a meat-fueled emotional roller coaster. And yes, the neighbors could smell it. And yes, they were jealous. In the medieval Irish diet, vegetables were not trendy. They did not come spiralized roasted with paprika or stacked in colorful Instagram bowls. No, vegetables were mandatory in the same way gravity and taxes are, unavoidable, occasionally unpleasant, and no one really wants to talk about them over dinner. After the high drama of the winter pig slaughter, which was a festival of fat and protein, the return to daily vegetables felt like a long, slow sigh. These were the bulk, the ballast, the green and white and orange things that filled the pot when the precious salted bacon was being rationed. Now, before you picture overflowing farmers, markets with heirloom tomatoes and smug kale, remember this was Ireland in the Middle Ages. You grew what did not die. That meant cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, and if you were feeling adventurous, wild garlic or something that may or may not have been poisonous. The local rule of thumb, if it kills the goat, do not eat it, and even then. You might wait to see if the goat was just being dramatic. Cabbage was practically a national identity. This was not the crisp, savory cabbage of a modern coleslaw. This was a hard-headed green or purple cannonball that grew stubbornly in the cold, damp Irish soil. It was boiled, stewed, or boiled again until it achieved the consistency of wet cloth and the smell of surrender. You would walk into your hut, and the air would be thick with the smell of it, a sulphurous, damp, vegetative fog that clung to your clothes and your hair. It was not an appetizing smell. It was the smell of Tuesday and Wednesday, and probably next Tuesday as well. But it filled stomachs and grew easily in soggy soil, which made it a favorite among peasants and anyone who valued survival over flavor. Leeks and onions were the medieval Irish aromatics. Not that they were used to build complex flavor profiles, no, they were just cheap, pungent, and available, which made them ideal soup fillers and enemy repellents. You would pull a leek from the garden, its roots caked in cold, heavy mud, the feeling of the icy grit on your hands as you washed it in a bucket of equally cold water was a daily penance. You would chop it, the sharp, green, sulphurous smell making your eyes water, then you tossed it into the pot with everything else, where its flavor would just melt into the general taste of stew. And then there were the root vegetables, namely turnips and parsnips, also known as potatoes before potatoes. These humble roots were roasted in the embers of the fire, mashed, boiled, or left in a corner until someone remembered to eat them. They were not exciting, but they were reliable. Like that cousin who shows up to every wedding but never says anything. They were the dense carbohydrates that made the watery brothchán or pottage feel like an actual meal. The legitimate historical event here is the pottage itself. This was the one-pot meal that defined peasant life. The cauldron, remember the one from breakfast porridge, was never empty. It simmered all day. A perpetual stew. Cabbage leaves, chopped onions, leeks, turnips, any wild greens, a handful of oats, and if you were lucky, a bone from the pig or a scrap of salted bacon. This was the meal. Historians still debate the exact daily contents of this pottage, while written sources from monasteries and noble houses list a variety of cultivated vegetables. We are less certain what the average peasant had. Was it just cabbage and oats? Or was there a rich mix of forage greens, wild garlic, sorrel, and nettles? The truth is probably somewhere in between, a taste that changed with the seasons and your luck. Interestingly, vegetables were eaten across classes. Even kings gnawed on leeks, albeit more politely and possibly with wine. Monastic gardens were full of leafy greens, beans, and herbs, grown by men who had taken vows of poverty and presumably anti-seasoning. Still, vegetables came with danger. Without refrigeration, improper storage could lead to spoilage rot and unexpected bowel pilgrimages. Peasants learned quickly to cook everything within an inch of its life, not to enhance the flavor, but to murder the microbes. So no, vegetables were not optional. They were the bulk, the ballast, the roughage that stood between you and starvation. And while no one carved a turnip to celebrate a feast, it was always there, stoic, damp, judging you from the stew pot. Today, foraging is something hipsters do on Instagram with baskets and hashtags. In medieval Ireland, it was what you did when your garden failed. Your pig was still alive, and you had too much pride to steal from your neighbor. Foraging was not cute. It was a full-time gamble. Part botany, part desperation, part praying you did not just feed your family something mildly hallucinogenic. This was especially true during the Hungry Gap, that dreadful period in early spring known as Engorda. The winter stores of salted pork and dried grain were running low or gone. The cabbages were eaten, and the new crops were just pale green whispers in the cold mud. This was when the entire village took to the woods and the shorelines, not for fun, but for life. You were not on a nature walk. You were hunting for calories. People roamed hedge and woodlands with the blank-eyed intensity of someone trying to find both dinner and purpose. Every rustle in the leaves made you jump. Was it a rabbit you had no way of catching, or a wolf who was foraging for you? You would kneel in the damp, your knees soaking through your wool trousers, feeling the cold mud and spongy moss under your fingers as you dug for pignuts or any root that looked vaguely edible. The forest was not a peaceful escape, it was a hostile pantry. Top on the edible list, wild greens, wild garlic, or creme was a lifesaver. You could smell it before you saw it, a sharp, pungent, oniony punch that hit the back of your throat. It was the first real flavor you had tasted in months. You would grab bunches of it, your hands staining green, knowing this would make even the thinnest oat gruel taste like a feast. And then there were nettles, the original superfood that fought back. You would spot a patch of them, young and green. You reach for a leaf, and a sudden, sharp, white-hot sting shoots up your arm like a tiny bolt of lightning. You can feel the welt rising instantly. You curse, wrap your hand in a scrap of cloth and keep picking, boil twice to remove the sting. Nettles were a vital source of iron and vitamins, a spring tonic that medieval people knew was good for them, even if it was a pain to harvest, literally. Then came the wild greens, sorrel, wild garlic, and dandelion leaves. These were not served on artisanal stoneware. They were boiled, slapped into stews, or chewed raw while muttering about hunger and fate. If it had leaves and did not bite first, someone probably tried it. Mushrooms, of course, were the Russian roulette of foraging, unless you had a wise elder or a very brave guinea pig. Picking the wrong cap could mean visions of Celtic gods followed by death or worse. 2 days of regretting your choices while lying in a ditch. Imagine finding a plump, earthy-looking mushroom. It smells good, like the forest floor after rain. But so did the one that made your cousin see dragons and then lie down forever. You might chew a tiny piece. It tastes earthy and meaty. You spit it out, your heart pounding, and wait. Historians still debate the role of mushrooms in the Irish diet. While some folklore suggests they were widely eaten, other sources imply a deep-seated fear of them. The Irish name for some mushrooms translated to serpent's milk, which does not sound like a ringing endorsement. This mycophobia might have been a very sensible survival strategy. Hazelnuts and acorns were gathered too. Hazelnuts were a treat if you could beat the squirrels. Acorns required soaking and leaching to be edible, an odd and laborious detail. You had to boil them repeatedly or soak them in a running stream to get the bitter, poisonous tannins out. The resulting paste was gritty and tasted like regret, but it was calories. Even seaweed made its way into Irish diets, particularly along the coast. You would walk the shore at low tide, the air thick with the smell of salt, iodine, and rotting sea life. The rocks were slippery with green slime. Coastal dwellers collected dulse, a tough leathery red seaweed, and labor, which we know today as nori. You would chew the dulse raw, a rubbery, intensely salty sheet of sea-flavored plastic that made your jaw ache. But it was packed with minerals, and most importantly, it was free. Foraging also taught you how to look busy while avoiding farm chores. I am gathering herbs, often translated to, I am hiding from Aunt Maeve and her cabbage assignment. Ultimately, foraging in medieval Ireland was not about connecting with nature. It was about not dying. It was unpredictable, often risky, but occasionally rewarding. Kind of like marriage, but with more moss. And yes, sometimes it was surprisingly tasty. But no one ever admitted that, because if you did, you might get assigned to full-time foraging. And no one wanted that. Monks, the original meal preppers. In medieval Ireland, monasteries were not just places for prayer, manuscript illumination, and awkward vows of silence. They were also culinary strongholds, feeding dozens of cloistered men who had taken vows of poverty but apparently not blandness. While the forager you were risking life and limb for a handful of nettles. The monks down in the valley were looking at their well-stocked larders and debating theology. You see, while peasants gnawed on turnips and dreamed of bacon, monks were quietly feasting in stone-walled refectories with surprisingly decent menus. The air in a monastery was different. It did not smell of damp and despair. It smelled of beeswax, incense, baking bread, and the complex herbal scent of a well-tended garden. It was the smell of order and, frankly, better food. Sure, they did not eat meat. The rule of St. Benedict, which many Irish monasteries followed, was quite clear on this. No meat from four-legged animals. This was a rule of austerity, a way to tame the flesh and focus the mind on God. But medieval monks were resourceful. They were educated, and they were very, very good at finding loopholes. This led to a historical event of culinary classification that is both brilliant and deeply weird. The great fish loophole. First, actual fish were fine. Fish, as we all know, are not meat. They're just wet. This was great news for an island nation. Monasteries often had their own sophisticated fish ponds or weirs on rivers. They ate herring, trout, salmon, and especially eels. Eels were a delicacy, fatty and rich, often baked into pies, but the monks did not stop there. They looked at the animal kingdom and started asking questions, theological questions. What about an animal that lives in water? What about an animal with a scaly tail? Enter the beaver. Yes, the beaver, in a stroke of theological brilliance that could only be argued by a man who really missed pork. Beavers were declared fish. The argument went like this: it spends its life in water, and its tail is scaly, not furry. Therefore, for all ecclesiastical and culinary purposes, it is a fish. Imagine being the first monk to argue that. You would be a hero in the refectory. The taste, a probably rich, fatty, and a little gamey. Not quite fish, not quite meat, but definitely not a violation of the rules. You would eat it, feeling the tender, dark flesh fall apart in your mouth, tasting the smoky fat, and silently thanking God for your clever brain. And it did not stop with beavers. This odd detail gets better. Puffins. Barnacle geese. Basically, any bird that spent a lot of time in the water was often fair game. Barnacle geese were a special case. Medieval scholars believed they did not hatch from eggs, but spontaneously generated from barnacles on driftwood. Since they were not technically born of flesh, they were not meat. You cannot make this stuff up. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was, or if it was a later exaggeration. But the evidence for reclassifying animals to get around dietary rules is surprisingly strong. Monastic meals followed strict routines: 2 meals a day, 1 in the late morning, 1 in the evening, and no snacking in between, unless you were secretly growing a third arm and needed the calories. Silence was expected during meals. You would sit at a long wooden table. The only sound would be the scraping of spoons on bowls and the monotonous, droning voice of one monk reading from a sacred text. You would eat in total silence, trying not to slurp your soup too loudly and attract the judgmental gaze of the abbot. The food, better than you would think. They had breads, often made from better grain, wheat even, sieved. Not the coarse oat slabs you were eating. They had vegetables from carefully tended monastery gardens, peas, beans, herbs, not just the mandatory cabbage and turnips. They had cheese, butter, whey, remember that white gold, and honey, all made on site with monkish dedication and probably some low-level existential dread. Fish, both fresh and salted, made frequent appearances. Fasting days. Oh, plenty of them. But medieval fasting did not mean starvation. It meant creative menu adjustments, swapping pork for eel or beaver. and calling it a spiritual triumph. Some monasteries even made luxurious fast stews rich in butter and greens because God might be watching. But he had not issued a spice ban. Monks also practiced hospitality. Travelers, pilgrims, and freeloading noble cousins often got a seat at the table, proving that generosity and grudge intolerance were both divine virtues. In short, monastic meals were hearty disciplined and a little sneaky. The monks may have been celibate and silent, but they were not about to suffer bad food. After all, if you are giving up women, music, and personal freedom. The turnip soup better slap. If you were a noble in medieval Ireland, your life was essentially one long waiting period between banquets, occasionally interrupted by skirmishes, political marriages, and mild inbreeding, while the monks were busy arguing that a beaver was a fish. The Irish chieftain, or Ree, was busy proving he was a god by eating everything that walked, swam, or flew. When it came to food, the nobility did not mess around. Their meals were designed to impress, intimidate, and if possible, outshine the rival clan next door. Because what is the point of land ownership if your roasted boar is not bigger than theirs? You would walk into the chieftain's great hall, a long, smoky wooden building. The first thing that hits you is the sound, a wall of noise. Men are shouting boasts, dogs are barking and fighting for scraps under the tables, and in the corner a bard is desperately trying to pluck a harp loud enough to be heard over the chaos. The air is thick. You can taste the smoke from the central fire pit. It stings your eyes and coats the back of your throat in acrid soot, and beneath the smoke is the overwhelming smell of roasting meat, a heavy, greasy, glorious perfume of fat dripping onto embers, mixed with the sour tang of spilled ale and the damp wool smell of 500 unwashed warriors. Let us start with the meat, because no noble feast began with a nice salad. We are talking venison, wild boar, pheasant, and beef, often roasted whole over the open fire and presented like offerings to the gods of cholesterol. Venison was the jewel in the crown, not just for its flavor, but because hunting it required land leisure and at least 2 sycophantic relatives to chase it into a trap. Eating deer meant you owned a forest, a status symbol in itself. The taste was lean, irony, and gamey, a wild flavor that spoke of the woods. Then there was beef. Remember the cows that peasants treasured for milk. Nobles ate them. A lord who slaughtered a cow just for a feast was making a powerful statement. He was literally eating his currency, a delicious act of financial recklessness. But the true showstopper, the odd detail of the noble table, was the swan or the peacock. These birds were carefully roasted and then, in an act of medieval taxidermy, redressed in their own feathers. The swan would be brought out, its long neck propped up, its feathers gleaming in the firelight. It looked magnificent. It also tasted, according to most accounts, like a boiled rubber boot. It was stringy, tough, and generally awful. But you were not eating it for the flavor. You were eating it for the Instagram post. This was pure theater, a way to show you were so rich you could make even your dinner look beautiful and slightly terrifying. Historians still debate the practicalities of this. Was it just the feathers, or was the skin reattached? Either way, it was a culinary prop, a centerpiece designed to make rival chieftains feel inadequate. There were stews, of course, because you cannot serve roasted swan every day without causing a diplomatic incident with the lake spirits. Stews were where nobles tossed everything else: rabbit onions, herbs, and enough spices to bankrupt a peasant. Cinnamon cloves, imported pepper. Yes, because nothing says local warlord like aggressively seasoned goat. Bread came in varieties. Nobles got fine wheat bread, the Arenfind, while the peasants were still gnawing on oat cakes resembling medieval floor tiles. You would tear a piece of this bread. It was soft, warm, and fluffy, the feeling of the light crumb against your fingers, so different from the gritty oat cakes, was a luxury in itself. It smelled of yeast and sweet wheat. This bread was often used as a trencher. A thick slice used as a plate, you would pile meat onto it, and the bread would soak up all the rich juices. At the end of the meal, you might eat the trencher, or you might toss it to the dogs, or to the poor waiting outside the hall, an act of performative charity. And let us not forget the butter and cheese. Irish butter was famous even then. So good, in fact, that some chieftains buried it in bogs to age it. Remember that bog butter, and hopefully not forget where they put it. And cheese was eaten fresh or aged until it could legally be classified as a weapon. Booze, naturally ale, mead, and wine imported for status not flavor, flowed freely. The line between feast and drunken poetry competition was dangerously thin. The nobles also dabbled in desserts, mostly honey cakes, spiced fruit concoctions, and dairy-heavy sweet treats that required more cows than a monastery during Lent. In short, noble feasts were where diplomacy, gluttony, and light flexing met. They were less about nutrition and more about making sure your enemy saw you bite into a swan leg with deliberate, unbroken eye contact. Before sugar elbowed its way into every medieval pastry like a high-maintenance guest at a feast, there was honey, golden, sticky, slightly bee-adjacent, and the undisputed ruler of medieval Irish sweetness. If you lived in early medieval Ireland and craved something sweet, your options were exactly two: honey, and finding a berry bush and pretending you liked the sour ones. Remember those noble feasts, the honey cakes, the glazed meats? All of that came from the smallest, most terrifying livestock in Ireland. The bee, imagine tasting it pure, a piece of honeycomb. You bite down, the wax gives a slight, satisfying resistance, then bursts, releasing a flood of liquid gold onto your tongue. It is not just sweet, it is floral. It tastes like the clover and heather of a summer field. It is warm and thick and coats your entire mouth. This was not just a treat, it was a currency, a medicine, a flavor enhancer, and if you were ambitious, a shortcut to immortality, or at least to getting sticky hands. Beehives were prized property. The bees, the beck, were tiny winged livestock. And this is the legitimate historical event. The Brehon laws, the ancient Irish legal system, had an entire section on bees, the Bec Bretha. These laws were incredibly specific. They detailed ownership of swarms. If a swarm of your bees left your land and settled on the neighbor land, the law detailed who got the honey. Often a complex fractional share. If you were stung by the neighbor bees, you might be entitled to a portion of their honey as compensation, assuming you survived the sting. No joke. There were fines for honey theft. That is how sugar-deprived everyone was. Stealing a hive was like stealing a cow, only smaller and angrier. Monasteries, remember the monks, were major centers of beekeeping. The monks needed vast amounts of wax for their devotional candles. To light the dark scriptoriums and chapels, the honey was a very welcome and very profitable byproduct of their piety. A monk could contemplate the divine while tending his hives. Approaching a hive, a woven straw skep, was an exercise in bravery. You would hear at first a low, pulsing, collective hum that you feel in your chest. The air around it is warm and smells of wax and a faint, sweet, floral perfume. It is the sound of 1,000 tiny workers, and you are about to rob them. Harvesting it was a nightmare. You would wear a thick wool cloak, your hands wrapped in cloth. But it was never enough. The smell of smoke from your smoldering turf torch used to calm the bees, fills your nose and stings your eyes, but a few guards always get through. You feel a sudden, sharp, burning needle pierce your neck. The pain is electric, and it is followed by a deep, hot, throbbing ache. You try not to swear, because you are probably a monk, or at least within earshot of one. Historians still debate the extent of wild honey gathering versus organized apiculture in early medieval Ireland, how much was farmed and how much was hunted for in hollow trees. It was likely a mix of both, a dangerous art and a careful science. And here is the odd or unusual detail: honey as medicine. Medieval Ireland understood its power. It was smeared on wounds, cuts, and burns. Its thick, sticky nature created a barrier against the damp and the dirt. Imagine a deep cut on your hand from a farm tool. It is red and angry. Someone applies a thick, cool, golden dollop of honey. It stings for a second, then a strange, soothing coolness spreads. The honey is so viscous, it pulls the wound together, a sticky, golden scab. Its natural antibacterial properties, though not understood scientifically, were clearly observed. It was a functional edible bandage. For peasants, honey was likely a rare treat, flavoring for a special occasion oatcake. For the nobility, it was a kitchen staple. Remember that roasted swan. It was probably glazed with honey. You can smell the fat in the honey caramelizing over the fire, a sweet, smoky perfume that was pure status. It was used to balance the sourness of fermented foods or the saltiness of preserved pork. In the kitchen, honey went everywhere. It turned gruel into a dessert. It made old bread feel like a gift from the gods. It was drizzled on cheese, stirred into oat cakes, and mixed with herbs for sauces that made turnips. Remember the turnips. Slightly less bleak, but the greatest trick honey ever pulled, the one that changed culture, was when someone mixed it with water and yeast and forgot about it. The result was mead, a clear, golden liquid that looks like honey but is not. It is sharp, alcoholic, warming, and slides down your throat with the sweet, lingering ghost of 1,000 flowers. Let us talk about mead, the original liquid courage of medieval Ireland. If ale was the watery, bready, liquid survival you drank every day to avoid dysentery, mead or mid was its golden, God-touched cousin, the one who showed up only on feast days, told incredible stories, and usually started a fight or a poem, brewed by monks, gulped by warriors, and revered by poets who could not handle their cups. Mead was not just a drink, it was a statement. It was the distilled essence of honey. Remember that precious bee-guarded sweetness. And it was treated with an almost religious reverence. You did not drink mead because you were thirsty. You drank it because someone declared a feast. You just won a cattle raid. Or you just made eye contact with a bard, and now it is duel by lyre time. Mead was made by fermenting honey with water, which sounds simple until you realize it involves waiting, something medieval people were disturbingly good at. You would take a massive amount of honey, a king's ransom in bees, and mix it with fresh spring water in a huge wooden vat. Then you would wild yeast floating invisibly in the air would settle in and begin its slow, magical work. You would watch the surface of the vat. At first, nothing. Then, a few days later, a gentle bubbling, a soft hissing sound, like the vat was whispering secrets. It was alive. The smell was intoxicating, a sweet, floral perfume of honey mixed with the sharp, tangy funk of fermentation. It was the smell of alcohol being born. This process could take weeks or months, and the resulting liquid was a clear, golden drink that tasted like sweet sunshine and ruined many respectable decisions. In Irish society, mead had an almost mythical reputation. This is the legitimate historical event. Its role as the drink of kingship. It was not just alcohol, it was status, ceremony, and sometimes your only friend on a cold, rainy night when the sheep judged you too harshly. The high kings drank it from horned goblets, while lesser nobles drank it from slightly less prestigious horned goblets, peasants. They mostly watched and regretted being born without a title. The great halls of chieftains, like the one at Tara, were often called mead halls in the poetry. This was where the king's power was displayed. A king was a mead dispenser, a man who showed his wealth and generosity by how much mead he could pour down his followers' throats. And of course, there were mead halls. Medieval Ireland's answer to the nightclub. These were not quiet places for contemplation. Picture a smoky wooden hall full of bearded men trying to outboast each other while a harpist played a tune that slowly devolved into, "Why does everyone keep singing over me?" You're handed a cup, probably a polished cow's horn. It feels smooth and cool in your hand, a strange organic weight. Inside is the mead, a pale gold liquid that shimmers in the firelight. You lift it, the smell is faint, just a ghost of honey and yeast. You take a drink. The first taste is a shock of sweetness, pure honey, but before it can cloy, the alcohol cuts through, a sharp, warming fire that slides down your throat and lands like a hot coal in your stomach. You can feel the warmth spread instantly out to your fingertips and your cheeks. It is smooth, dangerous, and delicious. You suddenly feel like writing a poem or wrestling your cousin. This brings us to the odd detail, the connection between mead and poetry. Bards and poets, the Fili, were revered in Irish society, and they were often fueled by mead. It was believed to unlock the word hoard, to grant eloquence and inspiration, a few horns of mead, and suddenly you were not just a warrior, you were a poet warrior, capable of reciting your entire family's genealogy mid-burp. Poetry competitions broke out, riddles were hurled like insults, and occasionally someone would declare eternal loyalty to a potato. Historians still debate just how common mead actually was. Given how much honey was needed to produce it, it was an incredible luxury. Ale, made from abundant grain, was almost certainly the daily drink for 99% of the population. Mead was for the 1%, or for the most sacred feast days. It was not a common beverage, it was a ritual one. Its mythical status in the poems might be a reflection of its very rarity. A bit of literary inflation. Flavor-wise, it ranged from cloyingly sweet to shockingly potent. You could infuse it with herbs, spices, or berries. Remember the foraging? Assuming you had any left after the pig stole them. Me was adaptable. Me forgave you for your sins. Me laughed with you, then made you fall face first into a peat bog, and so in the grand buffet of Irish drinks. Mead was the queen bee, elegant, unpredictable, and slightly dangerous if you stood too quickly. That mead, remember that golden queen bee of a drink, was the fuel for the main event, the royal banquet. If you think royal medieval banquets were elegant affairs filled with delicate finger foods and polite conversation, congratulations, you have been lied to by every fantasy novel ever written. In reality, they were chaotic, meaty marathons where flamboyance met flatulence. This was the fled or feast, and it was the most important political tool a chieftain had. Irish kings did not just eat to live, they ate to prove things, status, power, divine favor, and occasionally the limits of human digestion. A royal banquet was not just a meal. It was a ceremony, a diplomatic tool, and a 4-hour performance of chewing, belching, and judging others for not having a bigger roast boar. You are sitting on a hard wooden bench. You are back to the damp wattle and daub wall of the great hall. The hall is a cavern of noise, a roar of 100 shouting men, the barking of dogs fighting for scraps underfoot, and the desperate high notes of a harpist in the corner trying to be heard over the din. The air is almost unbreathable, a thick, acrid fog of peat smoke from the central fire pit that stings your eyes and makes them water constantly. You can feel the tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on your face. Beneath the smoke is the smell, an overwhelming wave of hot, roasting fat, the gamey perfume of venison, the sweet scent of honey glazes, all mixed with the sour stench of spilled ale, damp wool, and the very human, very unwashed odor of your fellow warriors. It is the smell of power, and it is suffocating. The legitimate historical event here is the feast as a legal obligation under the Brean laws. A king or chieftain was required to show generosity, fear flata, or the ruler's truth. Part of this truth was providing for his followers. If a king was stingy, if his feasts were lame, his crops might fail, his cattle might sicken, and his followers would abandon him. A feast was not a party. It was a political and spiritual contract. You feed us, we follow you. You fail to roast that boar, we find a new king. The food itself, remember those redressed swans and roasted boars, was brought out with great ceremony. The boar, tusks and all, spit roasted whole, would be carried in by 2 men, its skin crackling and dripping grease that hissed on the floor. It was a spectacle. But the real politics started with where you sat. This is the odd detail, the texi or seating plan. The hall was meticulously organized. The king sat in the center, and every seat had a specific rank. The closer you were to the king, the more important you were. His chief warriors, his poets, his druids, his family, all had a designated spot, but woe to the man who sat above his station. Historians still debate whether these seating plans were rigid symbolic maps of the kingdom or just practical arrangements that changed with every feast and political allegiance. A visiting noble's placement was a public statement. Are you next to the king, or are you down by the drafty door with the low-ranking cousins and the dogs? It was a medieval seating chart of doom. And it caused more diplomatic incidents than any cattle raid. You are handed your portion not on a plate, but on a thick slab of bread. That trencher, a smoking chunk of boar lands on it. You have no fork, you have a knife, Your personal eating dagger, you stab the meat and lift it to your mouth, and the fat is hot and liquid. It runs down your chin and into your beard. You wipe it with your sleeve. The taste is incredible, smoky, salty, rich, and slightly gamey. You tear the bread, now soaked in meat juice, and stuff it into your mouth. This is not eating. This is conquering. You feel the grease on your hands, on your face, the warmth of the meat in your belly, and the mead in your head. You belong. You are part of this. Entertainment was mandatory. A proper banquet involved bards, feely, and harpists, crutire, and someone reciting your ancestors' heroic deeds until everyone had enough mead to believe them. The poet would stand, and in a loud sing-song voice begin to recite the king's genealogy, linking him back to mythical heroes and, if possible, a god. This was not entertainment. It was propaganda. It was the king's audio resume. If you did not hire at least one poet to sing your praises mid-feast, were you even ruling? By the end of the night, you were full, woozy, and several political alliances had shifted depending on who shared their pudding. And then came the leftovers, or as peasants called them, our entire meal. Kings had stewards whose sole job was to gather the scraps, the half-eaten trenchers, the bones, which were often better than anything a commoner would eat all year. These were distributed to the poor waiting outside the hall gates, a final, calculated act of generosity that proved the king's wealth was so vast, even his garbage was a feast. Welcome to medieval diplomacy, fueled by boar, barley, and bravado. When it came to cooking in medieval Ireland, the motto was simple. If in doubt, boil it, and if not in doubt, still boil it. Frying was for the rich. Baking was for monasteries. Remember those monks with their fancy ovens, boiling? That was for everyone every day, for every meal forever. The centerpiece of this entire culinary philosophy, the star of every peasant hut, was the cauldron, the choir. This was not a gleaming copper pot. It was a heavy, menacing, three-legged sphere of black iron, or sometimes bronze, passed down for generations. It sat perpetually over the central hearth, its legs sinking into the dirt floor, or it hung from a chain in the smoky darkness of the roof. It was the instant pot of its day. Minus the pressure control stainless steel or instructions, you just tossed everything in: meat, grains, herbs, sometimes a root you hoped was not poisonous, and prayed the fire would do the rest. Then you stirred it until it resembled food, or at least something warm and vaguely edible. If you were a peasant, your go-to-cooking method involved this pot. Hanging over a fire in the middle of a smoke-filled house with no chimney. Remember that hut from breakfast? The air is still thick with peat smoke, but now it's mixed with the smell of the all-day pottage. You walk in, and your eyes water instantly. The acrid smoke stings your throat and lungs. You cough, a dry hacking sound that everyone in the hut shares. You can barely see the back wall through the gray haze, and beneath the smoke is the smell of the cauldron, a bubbling, sulphurous cloud of boiled cabbage. Remember that cabbage. And leeks, and the faint meaty scent of a bone. It is a damp, stewed, permanent perfume that clings to your hair, your clothes, and your soul. Stews were the king of the kitchen. This was the historical event, the pottage, the perpetual one-pot meal. The cauldron was never empty. It was rarely even scrubbed. After breakfast, the leftover porridge, remember that, was just scraped to the side. Then the vegetables were tossed in: cabbage, onions, turnips, foraged nettles, a handful of oats or barley to thicken it, a splash of water, and it was left to simmer all day. If you were lucky, you had a ham bone from the winter pig slaughter or a piece of salted bacon to drop in for flavor. This was the meal. You would dip your oat flatbread into it, or just scoop it out with a wooden spoon. It was warm, it was wet, and it was calories, and this method was brilliant. It wasted nothing. Tough meats became tender, hard roots became soft, and most importantly, boiling made everything safe. It killed the microbes on the foraged greens and the bacteria in the questionable water. But there was another, stranger method of boiling, a prehistoric technique that somehow lingered for centuries. This is the odd detail, the fulacht fiad. These were ancient cooking pits found all over the Irish landscape. They were essentially outdoor boiling tubs. A trough was dug in the ground, lined with wood or stone, and filled with water. Beside it was a massive pile of stones and a raging bonfire. You would heat the stones in the fire until they were red hot. Then, using a long pole, you would lift these glowing, 1,000-degree rocks and drop them into the water trough. Imagine the sound. It is not a gentle simmer. It is a violent explosion, a loud, sharp crack as the fiery stone hits the cold water. A massive cloud of scalding steam erupts, a sudden, wet, hot fog that smells of sulfur, hot rock, and damp earth. It blinds you. It chokes you. It feels like you just opened a door to a volcano. You would do this again and again, stone after stone, until the trough of water was a furiously boiling, churning cauldron. Then you would wrap your meat, perhaps a whole deer, in straw and drop it in to cook. Historians still debate the primary use of these flatbread. Were they just for cooking? They seem incredibly inefficient for a daily meal. Were they for brewing ale? The hot water would be perfect for mashing grain. Or, as some suggest, were they prehistoric saunas, places for ritual bathing or communal sweating? The evidence is ambiguous, but thousands of these sites remain, a testament to a time when boiling water involved fire, rocks, and a shocking amount of steam. Roasting. Remember, the noble's feast was reserved for the nobility or people who had enough firewood and meat to show off. And yes, roasting a full animal did impress the neighbors almost as much as not burning your thatched roof down in the process. Baking was rare and required an oven, so monks hoarded that technology. They produced dense breads that doubled as dinner and doorstops. Peasants made griddle cakes on flat stones and called it bread. Desperate times, desperate carbs. So, yes, medieval Irish cooking had its limitations, but it also had a certain genius. One pot, one fire, one goal. Do not die. If you thought the medieval Irish table was just a chaotic mix of clans, cattle raids, and people boiling everything that moved, remember that cauldron. You would be mostly correct, but what often gets overlooked is the fact that they had laws about food, and they took them quite seriously. This was not a culinary free-for-all. This was a highly regulated system where your dinner was a direct reflection of your legal status. Enter the Brehon laws, the Cinches Mar, a medieval Irish legal system so comprehensive. It had rules for everything from land disputes to bee theft, and yes, even who got fed, what they were fed, and how often. You were not just a peasant, you were a peasant with legal dietary rights, sort of. This was the legitimate historical event that underpinned the entire food culture of a legal code that tried to manage hunger and hierarchy. For example, hospitality was not just a nice idea. It was a legal obligation. The briug or hospitaller was a specific rank of noble, a man whose entire job was to be professionally generous. He was legally required to keep his home, which had to be located at a crossroads, with its doors open to all comers, travelers, vagrants, or cousins twice removed. Imagine arriving at his house after a long journey. You are soaked to the bone from the rain. Your feet are bleeding inside your thin leather shoes, and you are half-starved, or you stumble into his hall, and the first thing that hits you is the warmth, a wall of dry, smoky heat from a massive fire. The air smells incredible, not of damp cabbage, but of a rich, perpetually simmering stew, the choir ermi or cauldron of hospitality, which was legally required to be always full. You hear the low murmur of other travelers, the clink of wooden cups. Someone hands you a bowl of this stew. It is thick with meat and barley. You taste a complexity, herbs, salt, maybe even wine. It is the taste of safety. This was not charity. It was infrastructure. A briug who refused the traveler food could be sued and ruined. This legal precision got even more intense when it came to rank. The laws detailed the lijst or right of each person. A king, a poet, a bishop, a farmer, a blacksmith, all had different legal diets. Let us talk about poets. Remember them from the royal banquets, the influences of their day. They were entitled to specific foods based on their rank. A top-tier poet, an ollum, could legally demand a seat at the chieftain's table and feast on pork, ale, and fine wheat bread, the arenfind, until his verses rhymed again. This was the odd detail, the precision of the poet's meal. He was entitled to the food of a king, which often meant specific cuts of meat, the choice bits, not the boiled knuckles. Meanwhile, a lowly beginner bard might just get porridge. Remember that? And a raised eyebrow, a common farmer, a boer, had a right to his own specific diet. It was defined as a meal of two breads, usually barley or oat flatbreads, with a relish or anlan. This relish was the key. It was usually dairy, a lump of cheese, a bowl of curds, or a drink of whey. This was your legal right, 2 carbs and some cheese. If your lord failed to provide the conditions for you to get this, you had a legal complaint. Historians still debate just how rigidly these food laws were enforced. Were they a real-world legal code or an idealized set of guidelines written by monks and lawyers showing a perfect society where everyone knew their place and their portion? The truth is probably that it was a bit of both, a system of ideals that people used to settle real-world disputes over who ate what. There were laws about fasting too. If a person wanted to protest mistreatment by a superior, they could sit and fast, trosket in front of the offender's house. The idea was that the social shame and the legal trouble of letting someone starve on your doorstep that would make you settle the dispute. Imagine the feeling. You are sitting on the cold, damp ground outside your Lord's gate. You are weak. Your stomach is a hollow, aching void. The smell of his dinner, that roast pork, wafts out, making you dizzy with hunger, but you stay silent. Your presence, a louder accusation than any shout. Today, we call that silent treatment. Back then, it was state-sanctioned guilt tripping. Even cattle were tied into food law. If someone stole your cow, remember that was your bank account. There were precise compensation rates, not just give it back, but give back the cow, the calf, a meal, and possibly an apology verse in bad old Irish. And remember the bees. A beekeeper had to share every third jar of honey with his neighbors, because apparently bee zoning disputes were a thing. If your bees wandered onto someone else's flowers, you owed them a slice of the honey pie, literally. In medieval Ireland, food was not just about survival. It was about justice. If you thought the medieval Irish table died out with the last bard and the final boiled oat, think again. The spirit of that table, equal parts hunger, hospitality, and stubborn practicality, still simmers in the Irish kitchen today. It is just traded the open hearth for an electric hob and swapped pig's blood for black pudding with a side of denial. The medieval diet of oats, barley, and dairy was a marathon of survival, but it was rudely interrupted in the late 16th century by a foreigner, a lumpy, unassuming immigrant from South America. This was the potato, and it did not just join the Irish diet. It staged a hostile takeover. This historical event, the arrival of the potato, is the single most important chapter in Irish food history. It was not medieval, but it was the heir to the medieval diet. It filled the exact same role that oats and barley had, a cheap, reliable, calorie-dense crop that loved the damp, miserable Irish weather. It was the pottage, the flatbread, and the porridge all rolled into one. Imagine being one of the first peasants to try one. You pull the strange, lumpy, mud-caked orb from the ground. It smells of nothing but damp earth. You boil it, as was the custom for all suspicious vegetables. Remember the turnips? When you break it open, a cloud of pure white steam erupts, scalding your fingers. It smells incredible, clean, sweet, and earthy. The texture is not gritty or stringy. It is fluffy. It melts in your mouth with a pat of salty butter. Remember that white gold, and for the first time in your family's history, you feel truly, completely full. The potato was a miracle, and it became a monoculture that would lead to both a population boom and a devastating famine. Historians still debate the initial impact, arguing whether its efficiency was a blessing or a ticking time bomb. But other parts of the medieval menu survived more directly. Remember that dense, gritty oat flatbread, the Iran baked on a losat. Its spirit lives on in Irish soda bread. Soda bread is the modern flatbread. It is a quick bread made not with yeast, but with a chemical reaction, the odd detail of modern Irish baking. Bicarbonate of soda, a simple white powder, reacts with the lactic acid in sour buttermilk. Remember the medieval obsession with sour milk, creating a fast, reliable lift. It is the direct descendant of the hearth bread. You mix it by hand. the flour and buttermilk forming a sticky, shaggy dough that feels cool and damp against your palms. You cut a cross in the top to let the fairies out, or to help it cook, depending on your level of whimsy. As it bakes, the smell fills the kitchen, not smoky peat, but a clean, sharp, alkaline scent of baking soda and toasted wheat. The taste of a warm slice, slathered in yellow butter, is the taste of home, and the medieval pottage, that perpetual one-pot cauldron of cabbage and scraps, is still here. We just call it Irish stew. The ingredients have changed: lamb or mutton, onions, carrots, and the potato. Always the potato, but the philosophy is identical. One pot, slow simmering, a meal designed to turn tough cuts and humble roots into something warm and nourishing. Black pudding, the modern name for drisheen, is still everything but the squeal, a direct, edible link to the winter pig slaughter and the refusal to waste a single drop. But the greatest legacy, the one that bridges the centuries, is the hospitality. Remember the Brugh, the hospitaller with his open door and his legal obligation to feed you. He is gone, but his spirit has possessed every Irish mother on the island. You cannot enter an Irish house today without this law being enacted. You are not asked if you want tea. You are told you are having it. A plate of biscuits, soda bread, or a full fry will appear. You will be told, "Eat up, you are wasting away." You will feel the warmth of the mug in your hands, the sweet clink of the spoon, the sudden, overwhelming pressure to eat. It is not just kindness. It is a cultural reflex, a 1,000-year-old legal code, the ghost of the Brayan laws, telling you that in this house, on this island, no one goes hungry, not on our watch. In the end, the legacy of the Irish table is not just in recipes, it is in resilience, resourcefulness, and relentless feeding. Medieval Ireland made cuisine out of chaos, hospitality out of obligation, and flavor out of, well, not always, but they tried. So next time you slice soda bread, stir stew, or burn a pancake while trying to channel your inner monk, remember you are not just cooking. You are participating in a 1,000-year-old legal, cultural, and culinary survival strategy. And so our journey through the medieval Irish kitchen comes to a close. We have sat in the smoke of the one-room hut, feeling the gritty texture of the oat porridge that started the day. We have smelled the sharp, tangy promise of butter being churned and the earthy, almost cheesy aroma of that same butter being pulled from a peat bog years later. We have felt the icy sting of foraging for nettles in the hungry gap, and the sacred warmth of honey, the golden currency of bees. We followed the monks as they cleverly debated a beaver into a fish, and we sat in the great mead hall, deafened by boasts, our faces greasy with the fat of a roasted boar. We have seen how food was never just food, it was law, it was status, it was survival, and it was a stubborn, resilient hospitality that echoes down to this day. The flavors of the past are never truly lost. They are just simmering in the great cauldron of history and in the heart of the Irish table, now. The fire is low, the mead horn is empty, and the hall is quiet. It is time to rest. Good night.